much for being here. I'm going to give my informative speech, Power and Authority Used and Abused. So, power can be described in many ways, but as written in the Webster's Dictionary, possession of controlling influence seemed like a fitting definition to me. Power has always been a necessary tool, especially for leaders to help control or influence the behavior of others. Throughout my life, I've learned about many leaders who have used their power for good, but there's still a handful that have used their power for evil. And I'd like to talk about some of those today. Because we all know that power can be extremely influential. And when used correctly, it can transform a person, community, nation, world, something greater than it was before. But when used incorrectly, power can be very destructive. And power used on a smaller scale can affect friendships, families, occupation, and even in the classroom setting. And this just shows that even though the average person doesn't have to deal with the pressures of running a country, they do have to deal with maintaining good relationships. And despite how easy it is to abuse large amounts of power, it can equally be abused in small amounts affecting the lives of others. I'd like to share some different examples of the use of power for gain, the use of power for good, and the influence of power on an individual. So let's start by talking about a leader who has abused his power. So during modern history, Hitler was a prime example of someone who abused large amounts of power. He rose to power through his charm, his violence, and many negotiations that he made. And through his cunning nature, he was able to manipulate a whole nation into this waging mass genocide against many innocent people. And he was quoted for saying, "If you tell a big enough lie and tell it frequently enough, it will be believed." I think we can all agree that only someone with evil intentions would say something like that. And he was able to blame the economic woe on the Jews, which helped him to gather this struggling Germany together and use all the power that he has built up as a major source of evil in the world. Now, in contrast, Eleanor Roosevelt was an excellent example of someone who used her power and authority for good. A biography written about Eleanor Roosevelt by Betty Boyd Carley mentioned she was, in her time, one of the world's most widely admired and powerful women. So Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, she participated in many American politics. And she was the First Lady. She helped change the role of the First Lady, and she was the First Lady from 1933 until April of 1945. And she advocated for human and women's rights. Before she became the First Lady, the biography stated she visited wounded soldiers and worked for Navy Marine Corps Relief Society and a Red Cross canteen. This work increased her sense of self-worth, and she later wrote, "I loved it. I simply ate it up." So we all have our free agency, and we like to think that we would use our power and authority for good, like Eleanor Roosevelt. But this isn't always the case. A study was done in 1973 to show the effects of the abuse of power. Zimbardo, who was a professor at Stanford University, he converted the basement of the psychology building into this mock prison. And he sent out this ad asking for volunteers to come help participate in the study that he was doing. And many responded, and he later followed up with an interview to make sure they kind of just met the right criteria. So he ended up with 24 male college students. And they were divvied out into the role of either the guard or the prisoner. However, this experiment was brought to a halt just 6 days in because of many unexpected dilemmas that came up. These guards and prisoners were falling into their roles quickly and unrighteously, especially the guards. An article titled "The Stanford Prison Experiment" of the webpage Simply Psychology, last updated in 2018, specified, within hours of beginning the experiment, the guards began to harass prisoners by taunting them with insults and petty orders. So I'm sure you can imagine these prisoners, they were getting frustrated and they started to retaliate. And these guards just became even more forceful because they could, because they can. And the guards would expel them away from the door by shooting chilling carbon dioxide their way. They would intimidate them by stripping them of their clothes, or finding any way to just put them in solitary confinement. Before this experiment, these guards, or the college students who played the role of guards, were the average college student. But when given just a small amount of power and authority, even though they thought they were using it righteously, they ended up straying significantly. One might think that when given power or authority, that they would opt to use it righteously. But this isn't always the case. Histories and studies have shown not only large amounts of power can influence, but small amounts of power can change one's character. I'd like to end with a story that hits close to home. It's a personal story of a family member of mine. So my cousin Natalie, she is known for her carefree, spunky personality. She just has a love for life and a love for people. But her husband Brian, on the other hand, has a strong, dominant type A personality. And the phrase opposites attract did not quite play out the way we all thought it would. Once they got married, Brian used his position as husband and just constantly degraded her. What started out as good relationships rapidly turned into something destructive and abusive as he became demanding in his words and his actions. He would use his academic status to push his family down to feed his narcissistic complex instead of bringing his family up. So, for example, he would say, I'm a doctor and I know you're mentally unstable. So, like Hitler said, if you tell a big enough lie and you tell this frequently enough, it will be believed. And that's what happened in this situation. He used his position as a husband and a physician, and it didn't take long for her to start believing these things. This subtle manipulation for years, it got to the point that she felt like she was incapable of functioning on her own. And she was beaten down both physically and mentally, and she was then left on her own with just 3 small children. The status of husband and father is one of the most powerful positions in our daily lives. Daily assurances that we are special and that we are worthy of love has these long-lasting effects, as well as daily comments that you are worthless and that your only purpose in life is to satisfy one's desires. Natalie no longer had thoughts of her own, and as a result, she ended up attending a trauma center that deals with sexual trauma and PTSD. So after returning from this trauma center, she was able to find someone who gave her those special long-lasting effects, that she was worthy of love. And she's now married and just welcomed a beautiful baby girl into the world. Now, in conclusion, throughout our life, we all experience having power and authority, whether that's a job, a church calling, being a spouse, a parent, or an older sibling. How we use this power, whether for good, for gain, or the influence of power on an individual is entirely up to us. In Alma 60:28, it states, "Yea, behold, I don't fear your power nor your authority, but it's my God whom I fear." So, in the end, we'll answer to him and only him. We don't need to be a leader of a country to abuse power. There doesn't have to be a mass genocide to exercise unrighteous dominion. Despite how easy it is to abuse large amounts of power, it can equally be abused in small amounts, just affecting the lives of others. So let's remember this and know that we can use the little or large amounts of power that we hold for good.